does economic inequality threaten our democracy? Is democracy even possible in this country without some level of economic equality? Our next guest has written a book on that subject, that very subject. The author is Ganesh Sitaraman. The book is The Crisis of the Middle Class Constitution, Why Economic Inequality Threatens Our Republic. So you know where he stands on that issue right from the start. Ganesh is an assistant professor of law at Vanderbilt Law School and a longtime advisor to Senator Elizabeth Warren. So first of all, Ganesh, thanks for coming on the program.
Thanks so much. It's great to be here.
Secondly, why the middle class Constitution? Isn't the Constitution for everybody?
Well, the Constitution is for everybody, but my argument in the book is that the Constitution was built on a set of economic assumptions about what the country was going to look like. And the understanding that the founding generation had was that America was surprisingly economically equal. And I know that sounds a little bit crazy to say today. It seems like that wouldn't be true. But if we think back to the late 19th century, America is actually a pretty sparsely populated area just along the eastern seaboard with some small towns like Boston and New York. But it's a far cry from Western Europe, which to the Americans is really the center of civilization, London, Paris. And so when the Americans look across the Atlantic, what they see is how different they are from the Europeans. Unlike in Europe, there's no feudalism in America. Unlike in Europe, there's no hereditary aristocracy in America. The richest Americans, people like George Washington, might have nice plantations and big houses like Mount Vernon, but it's nothing compared to the palaces that the dukes and duchesses of England live in. And there's these vast lands available to the West, which means that any white man, and it was limited to white men at the time, could move west and have a plot of property for themselves, and property was the main form of wealth at the time. So their sense was that they were the most equal society in the world, and maybe even in the history of the world. And that was the economic conditions on which they built the Constitution. And so that's why I think our Constitution is a middle-class Constitution. It's a Constitution that assumes America has and would continue to have a middle class that is pretty large and expansive.
And you had at that period in history, largely, almost exclusively, when you get beyond, a small class of urban merchants and others, you had essentially an agrarian rural society, right? And that stayed that way for at least 100 years. You had Thomas Jefferson, who was, I guess, considered the sort of avatar and fighter for these ordinary middle class, which at the time meant rural Americans. That seemed to work well for a while. As you were saying, the Constitution was based on that assumption. When did that start to go wrong?
So it started going wrong almost immediately as commerce developed in the early republic, but it really only went wrong in the late 19th century. And what happens in the late 19th century is there's a series of really important changes to the economy. Industrialization, urbanization, the closing of the frontier, the shift from agricultural and artisanal work to wage labor in factories. These economic changes put huge pressure on the underpinnings of our constitutional system. And people at the time recognize this. They see that economic inequality is rising. They see that economic power is being concentrated in the hands of a small number of people and corporations. They call these the robber barons, the plutocrats of that era. And this is what we call the Gilded Age. And it's an era of deep inequality economically and inequality that leads to political problems, and including political inequality.
And so we're talking now, and I'm glad you brought up the Gilded Age. Again, we're talking with Ganesh Sitaraman, who's the author of the new book, The Crisis of the Middle Class Constitution. I've been thinking and writing and mostly thinking about the Gilded Age a lot the last few years, because whenever I reach a moment of some despair about our political situation, which is not infrequently, I mean, I tend to be a positive thinker, but, you have your moments in life. I think about, well, wait a minute. They had many of the same problems we have today. They faced in the late 19th century. You had the tycoons, the robber barons. You had the enormous influence of business over government. You had J.P. Morgan telling Teddy Roosevelt, if there's a problem, send your man around to see my man, and they'll clear it up, and all that sort of thing. They managed to restore some level of balance after that, though, didn't they? Because I think of that, then they say, well, what did they do? Because we ought to be doing that. So what did they do?
So it's a great question. So, one of the most extraordinary things that I found in writing this book is how much the populists and the progressives innovated to try to address the economic crisis of their time and the effect that it was having on the republic. And they engaged in some extremely creative endeavors. So on the economic side of the ledger, these were the people who invented antitrust laws. They also passed a constitutional amendment to create an income tax and allow the government to create income taxes so wealthier people could pay more. This was a generation of people who started advocating for a lot of the big social policies to empower workers, things like maximum hours, minimum wages. There's actually in the 1892 populist platform, they argue for equal pay for equal work for women, using exactly that phrase, equal pay for equal work. At the same time, they also understood that they had to engage the political process. And so they tried to democratize that process by creating the first campaign finance laws. And this was also the group of people that passed a constitutional amendment to have the direct election of senators by the people rather than selecting them through the state legislatures, which they thought were often quite corrupt in how they were picking senators. So it was both partly about creating an economic democracy and about creating a political democracy, and they understood that those two things worked together, and that's how they moved forward and tried to address the Gilded Age's problems.
And if you look back at some of the figures of Gilded Age progressivism, populism, and then early 20th century and so on, you find what I'm always inspired by, and I'd love your thoughts on this, what I'm always inspired by is the immediacy and the relevance of some of their rhetoric to today's issues and problems. I don't know, what were your thoughts?
I think that's right. It depends on who you look at.
Of course.
But there is a real sense of that in some of these people. Teddy Roosevelt, for example, is an active believer that in order to have a political democracy, you have to have economic democracy, and he says exactly that. And that's exactly the kind of challenge that we face today. At the broader rhetorical level, I think one of the big differences between our time and theirs, and it's a difference that I'm hoping we'll move away from with partly with my book and with others thinking in this direction, is that they understood that these economic challenges weren't just a matter of economic policy or morality. They were actually part of our constitutional requirements, a constitutional fabric, that unless you addressed these economic issues, you couldn't really have a republic. And they talked about things like antitrust in those terms, in constitutional terms, that it was necessary to create these economic conditions in order to preserve and sustain the republic that we have. And I think that's something important that in a way we've really forgotten, that having a big middle class, having relative economic equality is part of what's necessary to preserve and sustain our republic going forward.
And I want to talk about this because I feel this gets to the heart of your book. And again, we're talking with Ganesh Sitaraman, who is the author of the new book, The Crisis of the Middle Class Constitution, which is, there's a school of thought in our politics that says, okay, we have a little issue with, there's too much money in politics and it's kind of polluting the discourse, and we ought to be able to rein in the Sheldon Adelsons or Koch brothers, what have you. But if we do that, if we tweak the campaign finance laws, we'll be okay. But it seems to me one of the central theses of, if not the central thesis of your book, is that no, you really, as long as there's this kind of by historical standards, extraordinarily high, and if anything, growing inequality, you really can't have a functioning democracy. I mean, that's the central thesis, isn't it?
So throughout history, people have understood that, and really throughout history from the ancients up until the founding era, and even after that, people understood that the balance of power in politics would inevitably come to mirror the balance of wealth in society, because people who have wealth will seek out power based on their wealth. And that was something that would happen. So if you had a small number of extremely wealthy people, you would eventually end up with some sort of aristocracy or oligarchy or plutocracy as they tried to use their wealth to influence public policy. But on the other hand, if you had a big middle class, the middle class would demand a share and a stake in governing, and you would end up with some sort of commonwealth or a republic or a democracy. And so I think, this has been a pretty common theme that existed in political theory and constitutional discussions for thousands of years. And it's one that we've really lost in a sense, is understanding how that influences our system. I think the real challenge in thinking just about campaign finance reform as a solution, and I think it's an important solution, but not a exclusive solution, is that money finds ways to be influential whenever you try to cabinet. So it's sort of like a whack-a-mole problem. You kind of bop the mole on the one side and it pops up somewhere else. And so if you address, say, Citizens United and money in campaigns, well, money might just move to lobbying. And now you have to address it in lobbying, but it might move to another kind of venue. And so that is part of the challenge that we face in this context. And it's why thinking about this in terms of inequality rather than just campaign finance reform, I think is important.
So let's talk a little bit about solutions, if you would. So here we have enormously high levels of inequality. We have job creation, but job creation generally in lower wage occupations and so on. We have, the Gillens and Page study out of Princeton showing that oligarchs, if you will, for lack of a better term, generally get what they want out of our political system. What are some things people could be pushing for on either the inequality? We talked a little bit about political reform. Obviously, publicly financed elections would help in a certain sense, but as you say, there'd still be lobbying, and there'd still be well-paying jobs for people in government afterwards. Another way, what's a good sort of palette of solutions that might address this constitutional crisis of inequality?
So I think on the economic side, there's a variety of things that we could do. Some of these we talk about a fair amount. We talk about raising the minimum wage. We talk about organizing workers through unions and through political movements. And I think those are really important solutions. Structurally, we can think about what kind of distribution of wealth does our economy produce in the first place. Some people have called this pre-distribution instead of redistribution. And policies in this category would include reviving antitrust, for example. So you see increasing consolidation in corporations these days. And that often means more power, both political power and economic power, going to a small number of firms, which squeezes out small businesses, entrepreneurs, and allows these big firms then to influence government, which helps them rig the rules to further squeeze out the smaller firms. And so I think that's a place where we could spend some more time as a general public thinking, how can we really work to have a more competitive marketplace, one that allows small and medium-sized companies to exist, because that will be helpful to a wider set of people than just being a country that has a few very, very small number of very, very large companies.
Right. No, for a variety of reasons, including absolutely. That's understood. And I guess, last question or last topic. And again, we're talking with Ganesh Sitaraman, author of the book, The Crisis of the Middle Class Constitution. So I think we have, as existed in the late 19th century, kind of feedback loop of inequality, money, and political influence kind of reinforcing each other. Are you optimistic that loop can be broken and that we can institute some of these constructive changes?
So I think the loop can be broken. And the reason why I believe the loop can be broken is because when you read the history of the country, and I think, for the people out there, if you read the book, one of the common themes that you'll see is that people make choices. And we, the people, especially in a democracy, get to make a choice of what kind of society we want to live in. And throughout our history, people have marched in the streets, they've demonstrated, they've pushed their representatives, they've run for Congress, they've done things that have created change. And, seeing that action as it's happened in waves throughout our history, I think really can give you hope that today, too, we also can make the kind of change that we need.
Well, I think that's a great response, and I really am enjoying the book. So thanks for writing it. Ganesh Sitaraman, the book is The Crisis of the Middle Class Constitution. Thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks so much for having me.